I started here and ended up here. I had a few stops in between and afterwards, which is this, which is all a roundabout way of saying that I spent roughly 350 euros on 5 to 6 controllers and finally found the perfect controller for me. So these are the 5 controllers I have been thoroughly testing for the past few months. Some more intensely than others, of course, but I gave all of them a fair shot. And while my main game is Street Fighter, my tests were predominantly carried out in Tekken 8 as that is the game I'm currently playing the most. Horde 42, Hariki, Seihaway, Cosmex, I'm honestly not entirely sure how that whole branding situation is working out for them right now, but it also doesn't matter. I'll just refer to the model names going forward. In any case, they also have a lot more controllers than the ones you're seeing here, but I was only interested in the 16 button variants. I would assume that the 13 and 12 button ones will be the same in terms of quality, usability and such, but I don't know that, so if you are interested in those specific models, I won't really be able to supply with any meaningful information. I also haven't tested the G or M series controllers as I didn't really care for the overall presentation and looks. That should be all for the caveats though, so let's go! This little thing is almost perfect with one small caveat. It is very small. In my opinion, the frame should extend by another 5 to 10 centimeters to each side so you can comfortably rest it on your lap. Personal preference, of course. There are absolutely enough people who do want something that's small and compact. Being forced to squish your legs together to be able to rest it on your lap just isn't that comfortable for me though. My wife has a laptop tray called Eyjolf, I think, from IKEA. Her exact model isn't being sold anymore, it seems. It now comes with a different cushion at the bottom, which also doesn't matter. What I'm trying to get at is that a lap tray solved my problem. That's my solution, of course, as I don't go to offline events, meetups, and don't really care about locals either. If you are someone who does go to all these places and it's too small for you as well, that might potentially create some problems. Sure, you could bring something like a lap tray with you, but at that point, it kind of defeats the purpose of the S16 being this small and portable to begin with. The build quality, however, is rather impressive. It feels sturdy enough given its size, the buttons feel great. The switches are so much nicer feeling than whatever Sanwa buttons, for instance, usually come with. The S16 also has a USB-C port to connect to your PC and console at the top, as well as another one on the left side. Honestly, I feel like it should have been on the right, but the fact that it has 2 to begin with is absolute luxury already anyway. All of this is even more amazing when you consider that the S16 cost me less than 70 euros on Amazon. It's not like almost 70 euros is nothing, but putting it in perspective, an original Hitbox costs 249 euros. It actually cost me over 300 euros originally with shipping and VAT import taxes. Not to mention that it came with a proprietary cable, could not be used on PS5 native games without spending extra money on it, an option that only became available quite some time into the PS5's lifecycle. Comes with no extra buttons than the standard 8 face buttons and the 4 directional ones, even though the cross-up has had an additional 4 for several years at this point. And most importantly, you usually have to wait to get your order shipped out to you. I'm not sure if that last point still holds true today though. Does that make Hitbox a bad product? No, of course not. I absolutely love the thing. But is it convenient outside of being in a match already? Again, no. And that is ultimately what it comes down to. I was looking for something with a good quality build that simultaneously offers more convenience. The fact that it came in at almost a quarter of the price isn't even something I was looking for. In fact, I'd already made peace with the fact that I would actually need to spend more money. I know that Hitbox is now gearing up to sell you extra buttons as extensions, and while I like the idea, I dread what the pricing and waiting times are going to be like in the real world. Also, the actual feel of the buttons is a mystery as well, as they're not uniform to Sanwa buttons the Hitbox has already, so unless you already got to test them, you don't know what you're getting. One major thing that I really like about the 4 extra buttons on the S16 is that they are exactly the same as all the other buttons. Pressing those buttons doesn't feel jarring, it doesn't give you a different sensation, it all feels like it belongs there. All in all, this is a solid controller. Feels great, but just comes in a little too small, unless that is exactly what you were looking for in the first place. As the frame size of the S16 was a tad too small for me, I went and bought the T16 as well. It's certainly a lot more comfortable to have it rest on your lap, and unless you require some special assistance of some sorts, you will not require a lap tray for this version. However, all the buttons on this variation are the equivalent of 30mm buttons. For the most part, it's not much of a problem, but having used 24mm buttons for over 4 years now, I've noticed some strain when stretching my fingers to hit R1, R2, L1 and L2 in certain situations. It depends heavily on the game you're playing, of course, the character and your button layout, but it can get tiring very quickly. If you're still used to traditional arcade sticks though, this shouldn't be an issue. I was also jumping back and forth between the S16 and the T16 so that my hands will be used to both at all times. To me at least, that's the easiest way to keep my fingers and joints accustomed to either without having to relearn how far my fingers have to travel each time I'm confronted with a different setup. Other than that, both controllers are almost identical, however the T16 is lacking the USB-C port on the left side for some reason. You'd think the bigger surface area would allow for even more I/O rather than less, but it's hardly a purchasing factor. Speaking of, the price for this one was €86 on Amazon. At a glance, this might look like the same controller like the T16. This is the controller I was looking for. It's very similar to the T16, albeit a lot thinner, and with 24mm style buttons for everything other than the jump button. Unlike Horde 42's other controllers, this one also has washers, which, sure, aren't as aesthetically pleasing, but at least there's nothing getting stuck under them. One of the extra buttons was also moved from the left of the jump button to the left of the left button. This makes a lot more sense in my opinion, but that really is just personal preference. Not only the washers, but the buttons themselves and the switches are also a little different. The buttons have a matte textured top, which is fine with me. It might matter to people who do button slides, as that could impact the friction generated while sliding. Whether it's better or worse, I can't say, as I don't utilize slides. I've always had issues with friction when trying that technique. But it is something to take into consideration if that is something you're using. As for the switches, the R16 uses Kailh? I don't know how to say it, this word right here. So it uses customized crystal low profile switches as opposed to the low profile switches the TNS series use. The only visual difference from the outside is the color. The crystal ones are transparent, whereas the non-customized ones are red. Based on the specs, the crystal switches should require less force to actuate, but from personal experience, it feels like I have to exert more force. Now, that could be due to manufacturing variants, something generally wrong with my device, or anything else really, right? As luck would have it, I have another one, and I can only assume that it's either from the same batch or that the thinner frame of the controller itself is responsible for that, as I still need to apply more force to activate the switch. I'm just guessing. I have no validated data to support any of this. Just bear in mind that on paper, it's easier to actuate. So if you were to get one and compare it to the T or S series, and it does feel easier than either of those two, it is working as advertised. That's just testing it though. Most people, however, myself included, will never ever really feel this during actual gameplay. The variance is minor, as the spec sheet suggests, and considering how much force on average you will actually use to press a button during a match, it really won't matter much to 99% of people. For this one I paid €65 on AliExpress, as it wasn't and still, at the time of recording, isn't available on Amazon in Germany. This controller is interesting, featuring smaller buttons throughout, except for the jump button similar to the R16, but with the layout of the S16 and T16. From the start I wasn't particularly keen on it, as I've now gotten used to having a dedicated button for my left pinky after using the R16 so much. That said, this comes down to personal preference. The U16's build feels quite different from the others. It has an opaque textured bottom and opaque buttons, so the LED lights only shine through the sides. This can look cool, though if you prefer fully illuminated buttons, you could always swap them out for clear ones. What really put me off was how cheap it felt overall. This one feels extremely cheap to me.
Cheap?
That's the thing. Yeah, like the whole, the touch and the bottom of it, to me, it felt really cheap.
I don't mind.
It's very lightweight for its size, which is not bad in and of itself, but the buttons are noticeably louder than those on the other controllers as well. While they're still quieter than a traditional hitbox, which does sound more like an amplified typewriter, the whole package just didn't feel convincing. The light weight and the louder buttons give it a flimsy feel that doesn't inspire much confidence in its long-term durability. On a positive note though, they did clean up the display nicely, so you don't have the ribbon cable showing through, which is a welcome improvement. But yeah, not the biggest fan of this one. I paid €74 on AliExpress for this controller, and it's not currently available on Amazon Germany either. To be completely transparent, I had absolutely no intention of ever using the B16 as a controller beyond just testing it. And nothing has changed after having tried it. As someone who has never played on keyboard and mouse until the Resident Evil 4 remake released last year, which was almost exactly a full 3 years after I had started using my Hitbox controller, I never really had the need or demand to use a keyboard or something mimicking its feel to play anything. As I am comparing it with a keyboard, what's the actual point of it, right? If I could just use a keyboard. Well, for one, size, but beyond that, it's recognized as a controller out of the box. Sure, my Wooting 60HE isn't much different in that regard. In fact, I had to turn that feature off as it was kind of confusing when I was going through the connected controllers on my computer. It means, though, that by connecting it to your console, all the buttons act in the same way with the same layout like it would with an S16. A hitbox, an Empress, and, well, you get the idea. Also, the directional keys are angled, which presumably is more ergonomic. I haven't used it nearly long enough to really make an educated statement here. I'm someone who types a lot and my hands are always angled anyway. I never really had the need for an ergonomic or split keyboard as, again, my hands are angled already with the standard layout. In fact, during the few prolonged sessions with this controller, I found my left ring and middle finger cramping up on several occasions. Nothing you can't solve with stretching and practice, of course, but I'm not sold on the angle myself at least. So in my opinion, and again, this is another instance of not having enough data to really make a solid statement, but I do think it's just personal preference. If you already have bad wrists, for example, and it will help you keep playing without feeling any pain, great. That's the whole reason why I switched to an all-button controller in 2020 as well, after all. It is still a very individual kind of thing, though. Having said that, it is pretty cool. It's probably an easier sell to most people, as looking at it, they would most likely have a clearer understanding of what they're looking at, as opposed to any of the other controllers here. It's extremely cheap compared to all the other ones, 40 euros on AliExpress, and it's very small. Honestly, I actually thought it would be even smaller, but that's probably because I usually see the Mini instead of the B16 advertised. The B16's layout is a little different when it comes to the extra buttons, though. L3 is to the left of square and R3 is directly below X. And the jump button is originally said to be the little spacebar on the left instead of the one on the right. I think the overall layout makes perfect sense, to be honest, but I did switch the left and right space buttons around, as I use my right thumb for jump. Other than that, I think it's a cool device, and the price makes it easy to just give it a go without feeling like you wasted your money. Unless you're playing on console, or you have a really bad keyboard, but want to play on a kind of keyboard, but without shelling out north of 100 euros, you probably won't need this.
I would prefer this one. This one, if you play with some sort of like board, it will be very easy for me.
Oh, like your lap tray.
Yeah, it's very easy to like guide because it bend.
Okay.
So it touched my finger directly. So this one.
Okay. All 5 of these controllers have both a USB-C port to connect to your system of choice and a USB-A port for USB converters like the Booter 5 or a Wingman or anything else to make it PS5 compatible, basically. Although I'm sure it might have other uses as well. The S16 is the only one I have that has a second USB-C port. I'm not sure why. The T16, the R16 and the U16 all have a lot more space available, but only the S16 has it. It's not a big deal unless your machine is to your left, you most likely wouldn't care to begin with. I bought this one along with the U16 back then as I wanted to see if it actually works, but the only fighting in my own that has a PS5 version is Guilty Gear Strive, so it's not like I'm going to be using on a PS5 anyway, but it does work. It gets past the 8-minute disconnect issue and keeps on working. Unless there's an issue with this further down the line, you should absolutely go with the Booter 5 instead of the Wingman, as it's just much more convenient. You don't have to think about it, as you can just leave it in that USB slot specifically made for it, and it won't snap off due to hanging off the side for like another 7 centimeters or whatever. It's a great simple design. It works. That being said, who knows what the future holds, right? A random PS5 firmware update could render it useless, and I didn't see any options to flash the firmware of the Booter 5 either. Then again, I might have just missed it. While it isn't expensive, I paid roughly 40 euros for it, it's still money spent you won't get back if it stops working. Overall, I'd say the build quality of these controllers is impressive. That said, I haven't had any of them for over a year, so I can't speak for real long-term durability. The larger models like the T16 and the R16 do have a bit of a bent gate vibe. They're quite thin with a large surface area, which makes them prone to bending slightly. It's not a deal breaker, but the occasional creaking noise can be off-putting. With the T16 it's more an audible issue, you don't really see it bending. The R16 on the other hand actually arrived bent. It is thinner and thus more susceptible to that issue. You can put it on a flat surface and unbend it back into shape, job done, but that's obviously a fault, not a feature. So far this hasn't caused any issues, but who knows what I'll be saying in a year from now. The S16, however, feels solid as a rock. And the U16, even though being the same overall shape as the T16 and the R16, doesn't bend. Whotility. Just allow me on this one. When I want to customize my Wooting 60HE keyboard, I'm navigating to whotility.io. So as this one doesn't have a memorable name, Whotility it is. This software really allows you to do pretty much everything you can think of. Map any button, including directional buttons, to any button. Check. Change directional input settings from D-pad to left stick. Check. Change what type your controller is supposed to mimic, like Switch, Xbox, PS4, or X input. Check. Add macros. Check. Changing the lighting of your LEDs. Check. Change what's displayed on the little screen that's part of almost all of the Hot 42's offerings. Check. In fact, you can even export out all of your settings from one controller and import it on another. Originally, I've only really set up the S16 and just imported the settings to the T16, then from the T16 to the R16, and finally from the R16 to the B16 and U16. There are some minor differences here and there that you need to take into account, like variance in physical button placement, but that's quickly fixed. You can also set up different profiles. You have up to 4 profiles and each one of them can be customized to your liking. I've set up 2 different ones. One is my Tekken profile, which uses left stick inputs for the directions so that I could map D-pad right to R1 and D-pad left to L1. The second profile is just a standard hitbox layout, mainly focusing on Street Fighter 6 and other 2D fighters. To switch through profiles, you can designate any button as a function button and then tie each profile to a specific button. As I have no use for a turbo button, that's the button I designated to be the button to change profiles. So hold turbo and press square for profile 1 or triangle for profile 2. Simple as that. On the macro side of things, it doesn't always seem to work after switching profiles. Occasionally I have to unplug my controller first and plug it back in before it works. But again, not a big deal. How often are you going to switch profiles while you're playing anyway, right? The web app is generally user-friendly, especially if you're already familiar with the settings and features. If not, there might be a bit of a learning curve, but once you get the hang of it, customizing your controller becomes quite straightforward. And if you run into trouble, there are likely YouTube videos or blog posts to guide you to whatever you're trying to do. There are plenty of options I haven't explored simply because they don't interest me or because I don't really understand them. After all, it's just a controller. Focus on what you need, adjust it to your liking, and then jump back into your game. After spending time with these controllers, it's clear that each has its own appeal depending on what you're after. If portability is your thing, the S16 is a solid pick, compact and well built, though it might be a touch too small for some. If comfort is your main concern and you don't mind a bit more heft, the T16 offers a familiar feel with its larger frame, although the 30mm buttons might take some getting used to if you're coming from something smaller. The R16 is without a doubt the standout for me. The 24mm button equivalents and thinner design hit the sweet spot for comfort, making it my go-to choice. The layout just clicks for me and the build quality is great. The little details like the washes and the slightly tweaked button positions are, of course, I should make a sticker for this at this point, they are personal preference. The U16 is still a better fit than the T16 in my opinion, due to the button sizes, but I just don't like the overall feel to the touch on this one. It is rigid though, customization is technically easier, not that it would be difficult with the other ones, and it is very light. Finally, there's the B16, a bit of an oddball, but a fun one. It's a great option if you want something different or if you're used to playing on a keyboard. It's cheap enough to experiment with, though it probably won't replace your main controller unless its layout happens to suit you perfectly. At the end of the day, it all boils down to what matters to you. Comfort, portability, or just something unique. Pick the one that ticks your boxes, get it set up just right, and you're good to go. I hope you found this comparison? That's not quite right, is it? Me sharing my experiences with these 5 Hot 42 controllers. 5? Yeah, 5. Useful. Yeah, should work. Thank you for watching and I will see you next time. Bye bye.